Every February 2nd, this one little groundhog in Pennsylvania basically becomes the most famous weather forecaster on the planet. But have you ever actually stopped to ask yourself, why? Why on earth do we trust a rodent to predict the weather? Well, it turns out this whole quirky tradition has an incredibly deep and fascinating history. And today, we're going to dig it all up.
So yeah, let's just get right into it. Why a groundhog? I mean, it seems totally random, right? But the answer is actually this amazing story that takes us on a journey from these ancient European festivals all the way to the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. So our story has to start with the celebrity himself, Punxsutawney Phil. But to really get why he's such a big deal, we've got to rewind the clock, way back, long before he ever saw his first shadow. That's right, the roots of this all-American tradition, they're not American at all. It all starts with an old Christian festival called Candlemas, which was a big deal because it marked the exact halfway point of winter. And, you guessed it, a huge part of the celebration was predicting the weather. This Old English folk rhyme pretty much lays out the entire playbook. The logic was super simple. If Candlemas was a sunny day, winter was going to stick around for a while longer. But if it was cloudy and gray, that meant spring was just around the corner. So how did this tradition make the jump across the pond? Well, when German settlers started arriving in the U.S. in the 1700s, they brought all their folklore with them. But they pretty quickly ran into a small, furry problem. And this is where things get interesting. See, back in Europe, the official animal forecaster was usually a badger, or sometimes even a bear. But in Pennsylvania, not so many badgers running around. You know what they did have? A whole lot of groundhogs. And just like that, a new weather prophet was born out of necessity. Okay, so this folklore was kind of bubbling under the surface for a while. But how did it go from a local custom to the massive official event that we all know today? Well, that's where a little town and a seriously brilliant bit of marketing come into play. And this timeline just shows you the whole journey. It starts as a simple folk tradition in the 1700s, but then, boom, February 2nd, 1887. That's the day Punxsutawney Phil officially enters the scene, and from there, it just explodes into the global media event we see every year. And this is the guy who made it all happen. A newspaper editor named Clymer Frias had this stroke of genius. He decided to brand one specific groundhog from his town of Punxsutawney as the one and only, the official weather forecaster. I mean, what a move. It put his town on the map forever. Of course, Phil isn't a solo act. The whole ceremony is run by this group of local dignitaries called the Inner Circle. They're the ones in the top hats and tuxedos, and they're the official keepers of the tradition. They do everything from taking care of Phil to, and this is the best part, translating his forecast from groundhogese. So we've all heard the phrase, right? He saw his shadow. But what does that actually mean? Well, the rules are surprisingly simple, and they link directly back to that old Candlemas folklore we were talking about. It really just boils down to this. If the sun is out and it's a bright day, Phil sees his shadow, gets spooked, and bam, 6 more weeks of winter for us. But if it's cloudy and gray, no shadow, and that means we're in for an early spring. Simple as that. All right, now we get to what is, hands down, my favorite part of this whole story. The absolutely delightful myth that there has only ever been one Punxsutawney Phil. It's a claim that completely defies biology, but honestly, that's what makes it so much fun. So just to put this in perspective, let's start with a little bit of science. Your average groundhog lives for about 6 years in the wild, maybe a little longer if he's living the good life in captivity, but just keep that number in your head, 6 years. Which brings us to the big, obvious question. If the very first official Groundhog's Day was way back in 1887, and a groundhog lives for about 6 years, how in the world is it possible that we're still watching the same Phil today? Well, the answer, according to the Inner Circle, is a magic drink. Yep, the official legend says that every single year, Phil takes a tiny sip of a secret groundhog punch. And each sip of this magical elixir supposedly adds another 7 years to his life, making him the immortal seer of seasons. And that really is what this is all about. Is the forecast scientifically accurate? Well, no, not really. But that's not the point, is it? The real value of Groundhog Day is in its charm, its wild history, and the fun of a community just getting together to celebrate something wonderfully strange. Which kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. In a world that's so driven by data and science, what's the place for a tradition that's built purely on folklore and fun? I mean, does it really matter if the forecast is right, as long as it brings a little bit of magic to the tail end of a long winter?